Okay, let's talk about the Tower of Babel. I don't mean to sit and just pick apart the Bible, but some people have made the statements that it is the unerring Word of God. People that are quite into Christianity have this idea, and it has to go with it. This is a famous depiction that we've seen of the tower probably many times in your life. It's not exactly correct, but it somehow has the aspects that show you that we all realize that this was a Sumerian ziggurat, which had happened. Yet, if you think through that concept, the Sumerians did not talk about the God of the Bible. So whenever they say they were trying to build a tower up to heaven so they could take over, it's kind of a strange concept when the Sumerian gods were thought to be in the same position, which contains a whole pantheon and not really anybody mentioned in the Bible necessarily, or in truth it's all but tried to be conflagrated into one concept where all of these things you hear about supposedly had happened to one people, and in a modern day we attach that to one single people instead of the whole 12 tribes concept that it began with in the first place. It's very prominent, even though it's been somewhat smudged over. And a side note, it never was such. In fact, quite the opposite. The other ended up being a side note. But if you think about this concept, the Tower of Babel was a ziggurat, and at that time, it did not get finished. Much like you kind of see the top of this where it's just not quite finished. And in doing so, the interior part, which they made out of these, was quite often just sun-baked clay bricks, which gave them some stability and made a mini mountain on the inside of it, and then they facaded the thing around with a few layers thick of actual baked bricks done in a kiln, just like our bricks are done today. But instead of using a concrete type mortar like we use today to seal it from the elements, they actually sealed it with bitumen or tar, or what some call asphalt, which is, from my understanding, got some bits of gravel and grit into it, which we use for roads, and that's asphalt. It's basically tar covered gravel sticking it all together, whereas bitumen is just the tar, like when you tar a roof, things like that. You tar this roof to keep it sealed, waterproof, and this same effect was used in this tower. But you can imagine if they were getting some rains, it would all rain down inside of this and channel through, and then being trapped by all these being bitumened out here, it rotted out the inside of it. What effectively happened was they got the thing 3/4 built and then didn't finish it for a while, and it got inundated so bad whenever they started to put the other weight on top of it and finish it off, like in the times of Nebuchadnezzar, it collapsed in somewhat. Then there was a strife between people and so on, and they stopped and just never finished it. But it was, looking at it like you look at the pyramids and stuff, was a belief that would have been much, much larger. Did a video about 1.5 years ago talking about this, where they found out that this place was Entemnanke, a place that was dedicated to Marduk in a later thing than this Babylonian idea. But as I've shown you so many times, the story of Genesis can be picked apart, and it's taken from Greek sources as well as the ancient Sumerians. Now, to the best of our knowledge and what it's told us all, that they only were there during that captivity period, learned these type of things, and came out of this. And that's where the startings of the Bible and its concept came from, where they took somebody else's idea and kind of said, well, it didn't happen just like this, it happened like that. And instead of invoking gods, they invoke people in the place of certain situations. But I've also shown you where Noah is pictured as being Uranus, castrated. That's the reason they had the sons put the towel over him and everything else. It's trying to make that out. And of course, Joshua ends up being renamed Israel, which is the ancient Phoenician word for the planet Saturn. So esoterics knew this all along, that this was connectives and putting it all in there, and it literally cannot be one people. But in a whole, it really was. It's the story of Caucasians and the thing they went through, and it's been broken down into a mythology. They refer to this by definition as a myth of something that didn't quite happen that way, but it contains some truths. I've revealed that to you just a moment ago. Let's look just a little bit of this. I don't want to go into the whole thing. It's quite extensive. But this is just the wiki article, which was fixed in January 16th of 2022 and has more added to it, where they start off, this article is about the biblical myth. For other uses, see Tower of Babel disambiguation. The Tower of Babel, Migda Bavel, narrates in Genesis 11:1-9, is an origin myth meant to explain the world's people speak different languages. Yeah, now see, here's the concept here, which it's kind of hard to get past. Just like a woman grew from a rib and ate from a magic tree because a talking snake told her to a lot of people is very hard to get past. The story is that they were building this tower up to the clouds, to the heavens, and it only got about 130 foot tall, which was extremely huge at that time, and basically a mountain towering over the city, just like that picture I was showing you. But when they got to that 13th level, that's where the problems came in about, and it was really only supposed to have been about that tall. But then it couldn't be that tall, could it? I remember being a kid and listening to this story and talking to my brother, who's actually a deacon of a church now, and he's deep into it, that when we went to the tower at Six Flags, which looks kind of like an Eiffel Tower kind of thing, and got to get up on top of it, it was way up there. The kids wanted to throw a coin off or something else, and I go, man, you could hit somebody with that, and a coin flying that far down could really hurt somebody, because I had heard about it happening on like Empire State Building and stuff like that. But amazingly, I had to mention, as tall as we were up there, we were so much higher than the Tower of Babel was supposed to be, and we're not even to the clouds or near it. But hey, bro, there's never been a airplane run into this heaven that's floating in the clouds situation, so it's all based on a rhetoric of bullshit, isn't it? If you were to build that thing up higher and higher and get to the point of being in the clouds, or have a foggy day where they come down, you think you would see something like that. I've seen a lot of pictures, of course, of people being up on mountains above the clouds, and it does give you this heaven-esque idea. Could be where a lot of that came from. But the concept that they were building a tower too tall, and so he had to strike it down, is actually found in a few other people's literature. Have comparable myths with that. We'll look at those though here in a second. Comparable myths, you might be able to see it small on the left hand side here, but with that comparable myth, there's Sumerian and Assyrian parallels, Greco-Roman parallels, even ones in the people of Mexico, Arizona, Cherokees, Nepal, Botswana, and other traditions. Really only need to concern ourselves with the first couple there, because They were the ones attached to it that finished off the story, using other Greek ideas too. According to the story, the united human race in the generations following the Great Flood was speaking a single language and migrating eastward. They came from the east. And they come to the land of Shinar. That's Sumeria. There'll probably be a small picture of it here, but that's ancient Sumeria, with Uruk, Nippur, Kish, Babylon, Borsippa, Sippar, Ashuna, Nuzi, Ashur, Nineveh, even Mary. Yeah, there's a city named Mary. A lot of these names are taken into other stories and sometimes put on people. But there they agreed to build a city and a tower tall enough to reach heaven. Now, this was supposed to be to where if there was another flood, all the people could get up on that as if it was a mountain and not have to worry about it. Strange thing is, a lot of cities were built somewhat near mountains, and sometimes were named after the nearby mountain, and so people could just do so. In fact, in a lot of the flood myths that people have, they climbed to the heights of mountains, and the people that were able to do so were the ones that survived. This is all conflagrated, and it comes back from a time from before. That's the reason I tell you that one telling of it coming through the Sumerians and so on was a local flood that happened there, and it wasn't for the rest of the world. If you simply take the phrase, which has been added on, scholars say in the Bible, where it says, and over the hills, you take that out and it just floods up. In fact, the only height they give it, other than later over the hills, is the fact it was about 18 cubits thick. Not very deep at all. Well, that's too deep for anybody to stand up in. People got flooded and washed away, and it tried to kill off a great civilization. And because that was the great civilization that was known, it got taken into that myth that they had, and something that happened again. But you see in the Bible, they tell you that it wasn't supposed to happen again, and God made a rainbow. Whether you believe rainbows never existed in the mist before that or not is another question, probably. But that idea that it would never happen again comes from the Younger Dryas event and a flooding that comes on. You see, they even in other parts show some esoteric knowledge, but they've got it out of kilter and still tried to comprehend and compound it in there. How the world was destroyed by fire and then by water and so on. Well, the Younger Dryas event burned up at least 10% of the forest all over the world, while a major portion of it happened in North America, and therefore the rest of the world wouldn't have been known why this shit's happening, but it is. Part of it even strayed all the way over into the Near East, if you will, an Anatolian type area. Recently did a video about this and how that ancient tell was destroyed around 12,800 years ago during that same event. So some of the cracked apart commentary fragments that were strayed apart across Earth hit mainly in the North American ice shelf. Some, it appears, must have hit out in the ocean. Another one struck in Greenland and made the Hiawatha crater, but another one came down and all the way to the point in the Middle East. Each one of these were huge events, like multiple nuclear warheads going off, and because they were streaking across the ground while it was happening, it's like stringing out a bunch of nuclear warheads. It literally lit the air on fire. It set giant forests on fire. It killed off all of the great last of the dinosaur type creatures that we had in North America. The last of the horse type creatures, camels, which originally came from there, and if they can make the trek, why couldn't anybody else that's more advanced than a camel? Well, they don't want you to have that idea. But now I'm getting off in left field and haven't even gotten a paragraph into it. They agreed to build a city tower and all tall enough to reach heaven. Do you believe that if they built a tower that could reach heaven? Do you believe that the Sumerians built a tower up to their gods that somehow at the top of that would have been the Hebrew God that we think of? They sure seem to think it was. But if you read their actual story of Genesis, they started out in Eden, which is what the Sumerians call their land between the Tigris and Euphrates and fertile land. And Abraham came from Ur. And then they went away and they started worshiping other gods. So actually the God of creation that's in that Bible story must have been taken from the Sumerians. Here we have another story that's taken directly from the Sumerians. Everybody understands this is supposed to have been a ziggurat, and it's from there, not from where you believe it in. Isn't that strangely revealing? Well, God, observing their city and tower, confounds their speech so they can no longer understand each other and scatters them around the world. Now, whether you believe that's the world at large and that we know today, or the concept that they used back then of the known world of humanity, which if you look at the old maps, don't show a lot of edging on it, doesn't show they know sub-Saharan Africa exists. The point somehow of India is taken off because those aren't the same people as of the north. Ancient Proto-Indo-Europeans and so on, all through China. Strangely, when we look at this idea that they all might have had one single speech after the Great Flood, we find that in literal speech and language, people have deduced, and it's very much confirmed, that there used to be an ancient Proto-Indo-European or Aryan language that all of these languages come out of and are derived from Sanskrit in India all the way to the islands of Ireland and all places in between, with a few exceptions in dialects that look like they're slightly different or variations on a theme. This is where we get the Hamitic idea and Shemitic idea of variations of languages that are there. And that is supposed to explain why everybody's not speaking the same language. Well, a lot of these people I've shown you were speaking one same language, and that's the language of mathematics, using similar mathematics for each other, all the way from places like Stonehenge, the pyramids, ancient ziggurats and things like that I've shown you too, where they're lined up to cardinal points and things like that too, and that's a common language, which spreads much different ways. An example, did you know that Angkor Wat was found to have Sanskrit writing onto it, showing you and revealing that whenever they talk about how they came from the east, perhaps where they used to be in older times. But in the Bible myth, it acts like nobody existed just before then. Well, there was a bunch of people, they were bad, there was a big flood, then ta-da! Who called them bad? Well, the people afterwards. You can see even though they're stealing the literature here, they're trying to play off the people as being bad. It left people pretty much dumbfounded to the way this thing looked, and therefore you get a few weird depictions of the ziggurat that's supposed to be there. But as we finally figured out Iraq and Iran and Tigris Euphrates, these people, and we found the ancient ziggurat, some have been well cared for and repaired somewhat here lately. You can see what they're talking about whenever people say a stairway to heaven, to these gods that were supposed to live in their abodes up on top of this. And so whenever they say they were building something up like this, it had already happened. It had happened in at least 34 other ziggurats before this one that we're even trying to talk about. But they acted kind of like it's the only one, and boy, they was big. If you'll read the stories on down from here that I'm not going to show today, they'll actually tell you that this thing was 8 miles high. Why? Well, because some mountains at about 8 miles high have clouds on top of them, and so that would recreate something like that. But does anybody listening believe that there was possibly a brick tower that was built like this that was 8 miles high ever? If God really didn't like it that you were building a tower right up to him and it was gonna happen, and if he doesn't stop it, he said himself that there's no telling what these people could do. So instead of having that same language, they decided to confound everybody where they couldn't speak to each other and so on. Like all of a sudden, if you didn't understand what somebody said, you didn't know how to put the next brick down. It doesn't make any sense, but it was supposed to make sense of the idea of everyone having different languages instead of speaking the same. In reality, though, it tells you that everybody was speaking the same, and then it started to be different. But it pinpoints it on this tower that didn't quite make it. We know today in reality that there were a lot of different languages at that time, so this is untrue. Of course, up until recently, some of this wasn't found out, and so people were still led to believe somehow that might have something to do with reality. There are still people today that don't understand any of this and just want to go with it because, well, other people go with it. I want to go with the rest of stupid or unknown. Some modern scholars have associated the Tower of Babel with known structures, notably Enkimanke, a ziggurat dedicated to the Mesopotamian god Marduk in Babylon. A Sumerian story with some similar elements is told in Immarkar in the Lord of Arata. I have that loaded up to talk about something else that goes back to a people before the Sumerians that had something going on, because the Sumerians are talking about it as these lords of Arata and how that leads on back to another place which pegs at a date of about 22,000 BC, and it even shows these people were saying the names of the Sumerian gods almost quadruple the age that we would think of as being Sumerians. It's incredible. It looks like it's the very first writings. It's a scratch type writing, but it seems so simplistic. Some of the guys has figured it out on what bent lines mean, short and long lines and so on, and they only had about 12 different expressions of sounds, but then again you can get ka and out of different phonetics out of that. And it talks about Inanna and Nutu. That's for a different video here. So again, the narrative tells you that, and the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. Now, does anybody believe that was ever true in the history of all humanity? Or are they just talking about all these Caucasian type people that all had a similar language which broke off long, long before this ever happened? They had one speech, and it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shemar and dwelt there. And they said to one another, "Go, let us make brick," which is just like, poof, and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime they had for mortar. Now, this slime they're talking about is not slime and swill of a pond. It's actually bitumen, and that was mistranslated. And they said, "Go to, let us build a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered upon the face of the whole earth." So they were going to make a name for themselves there, lest we be scattered upon the face of the whole earth. Sounds like what God did, took these people, the ancient Sumerians, and scattered them across the face of the earth, doesn't it? But backing up one step, they talk about let us make brick, and you just gotta understand that brick was actually turning clay, firing it, and turning it into stone. It was like magic, every single one of them. And then they glazed some of these, where they fired them again after putting a paint on that was made up of chips of certain gemstones and certain stones, and they would get it so hot that it would fuse onto it, kind of like they do in ceramics and stuff nowadays. And they said, let us go build a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make a name, lest we be scattered upon the face of the earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men builded. Now see how there's children of men? This is another showing you that there were some gods of the earth going on before this, in comparison to everyone else, so dramatically different that no one else saw them as being anything short of gods. And their children, the ones that built this. And the Lord said, behold, the people is one. That's bad grammar. And they have all one language, and this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Which, like, they're so amazing, they can imagine and make anything happen, so I've got to screw this up somehow. I talked about this in one version of this, how God wanted people to be stupid. Well, the people that have all conjured up these myths and idea wanted you to end up staying ignorant to the truth and twist it around into something that actually has no basis on reality. We're talking about Babylonian towers here. How could that have anything to do with that other god, unless they're trying to say, oh, well, it's all the same? Let me tell you one thing for sure. The Bible up until this point has never been looked at as, oh, well, they're all the same. In fact, it's the only one that's really true, and all the other ones were liars, and all the other ones were pagans, and all the other ones were, well, pagan just means agriculturists, and we come to find out that if they're stealing the stories and the concepts and the places and saying they were there whenever these things happened, what does that tell you? So go let us down there and confound their language that may not understand one speech. This was supposed to be the idea of why the tower only got built to a certain point. So the Lord scattered them abroad, which actually means over the waters, from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Like they just blew it off, and they blew off the city, which is not true at all either. Any city that contains those ziggurats carried on for thousands of years. It was the ziggurat that got left alone because it could not be finished. It would cave in. Therefore its name is called Babel, because the Lord there confound the language of all earth. From thence did the Lord scatter them abroad on the face of all earth. Well, there's some etymology to that. The phrase Tower of Babel doesn't actually appear in the Bible. It's always the city and the tower. The original deviation of the name Babel, also Hebrew name for Babylon, is uncertain. Well, it's not really that uncertain. It has to do with where the Babel comes from, and it really meant books and knowledge and things like that. And why there's Byblos over here and Babylon over there too. The native Akkadian name for the city was Bab-elim, meaning gate of God. Elim, Elu, El, like Bab-el, was the gate of the god. But what god was that we're talking about then? Well, that's El of the Canaanites. So again, not the right one that we're supposed to be talking about, but they're saying that it's there. Gate of the gods, that's what the Sumerians called them. However, that form and interpretation itself are now usually thought to be the result of an Akkadian folk etymology applied to an earlier form of the name Babila, of unknown meaning and probably non-Semitic origin, by the way. According to the Bible, the city received the name Babel from the Hebrew verb balal, meaning to jumble or confuse. But balal doesn't have to do with Baal-el, but Baal-al or Baal-el shows you another god in place in a situation. Dating of the Tower of Babel. Some scholars use internal and external evidence to offer 3500 to 3000 BC as a likely range for the date. However, based on 5 details included in the narrative: 1. The event took place in Shinar at Babylon in particular. 2. The event involved the building of a city and a tower. 3. The tower was constructed of baked brick. 4. The mortar used was asphalt. 5. The tower was very probably a ziggurat. There's a lot of stories along with this. Josephus actually says a lot of things about it, but let's just look at a couple of parallels and see if you see any similarities and where they got that little story all from. See, there's a Sumerian myth similar to that of the Tower of Babel called Merkar and the Lord of Arata, wherein Merkar of Uruk is building a massive ziggurat in Eridu and demands a tribute of precious materials from Arata. And that's, by the way, our Ararat also, for its construction, at one point reciting an incantation imploring the god Enki to restore, or in Kramer's translation, to disrupt the linguistic unity of the inhabited regions. Named as Shibur, Hamazi, Sumar, Urukai, yes, Urukai, they say that's Akkad, but that gives you an idea where the Urukai in Lord of the Rings comes from. And the Martu land, which has to do with Marduk. The whole universe, the well-guarded people, may they address Enlil together in a single language. So see, this was whenever Enlil took over, and that's of course that sky god situation from Enki, which is Lord of all the earth, and not the sky. In addition, the further Assyrian myth, dated from the 8th century BC during the Neo-Assyrian Empire, bears a number of similarities to the later written biblical story. So, in Greco-Roman parallels, in Greek mythology, much of which was adopted by the Romans later, there's a myth referred to as the Gigantomachy, a battle fought between the giants and the Olympian gods for supremacy over the cosmos. In Ovid's telling of the myth, the giants attempt to reach the gods in heaven by stacking up made mountains, but are repelled by Jupiter's thunderbolts. A.S. Klein translates metamorphosis, rendering the heights of heaven no safer than the earth. They say the giants attempted to take the celestial kingdom, piling mountains up to the distant stars. Then the all-powerful father of the gods hurled his bolt of lightning, fractured Olympus, and threw Mount Pelion down from Ossa below. Biblical scholar Philip Woodbaum suggests that the author of Genesis was familiar with the Gigantomachy myth and used it to compose the Tower of Babel story, or it actually had Greeks entwined in it, like the Septuagint, and so they were taking and putting 3 things together as one and calling it one, or more in many cases. It's an incredible book that they've been able to do this. When you look into it, they're like, ha ha ha, did I lie? Yes, quite a bit. But you did so in the effort to try to pull it all together as one, saying that all these Caucasians came out of a boat in Ararat, which is Arata, and somehow their 3 kids became 3 different sets of people. That's not the way that goes either. I've done videos about that and the way that that actually works in rational ways. And of course, Hamites were the Caucasians of North Africa and Egypt that founded it in the first place. So there are other tales in Mexico where they talked about trying to build up a huge ziggurat type of depiction, but then again, it was that men had multiplied after the following great deluge, and they erected Zakuli, or a tower, to prevent themselves in the event of a second deluge. However, their languages confounded and they went separate parts of the earth. Isn't it strange how they have something just like that? I've showed many times that there are some myths that are all across that are showing you they go from a time before the Indians came into America, because they're too common to each other, even where totem poles come from and things along that. stories told all the way down through, but there's a lot of other traditions. In the 1918 book Folklore in the Old Testament, Woo, Scottish social anthropologist Sir James George Fraser documented similarities between the Old Testament stories, such as the flood, and indigenous legends that were around the world. Of course, people back then said, oh, well, see, the flood did happen, but then we look around and it all happened at different times, and then people had this old story which apparently was about the flood that happened after the Younger Dryas event, and especially because it talks about how the waters came from up from below also. Whenever that flooded under a place, well, that's actually just filling up more. That's whenever the sea levels rose so much, so rapidly. A lot of people have made these connections now. I'm not alone at all. Genesis makes no mention of any destruction of the tower. The peoples whose languages are confounded simply scattered over from the face of the earth and stopped building their city. That's what we actually find in reality. It was a ziggurat built 3/4 or more. When they built more onto it, it started to cave in. They stopped. It got inundated with more water and slowly caved in. It became famous over time, and people took those bricks and ended up making a lot of the other city later, hundreds if not thousands of years later. And other sources, such as the Book of Jubilees, Cornelius Alexander, Abdinius, Josephus, and Sibylline oracles, are shown to have the same concept. God overturns the tower with a great wind. In the Talmud, it's said to be the top of the tower was burnt, the bottom was swallowed, I guess by water, and in the middle was left standing to erode over time, indicating that a flood had gotten to the tower from the bottom part, and whenever it did so, it got saturated inside and probably caused a large bit of the problem. Entymanke, Sumerian, temple of the foundation of heaven and earth. So this is the concept here in heavens to earth. That's got to be it. Was the name of the ziggurat dedicated to Marduk in the city of Babylon? So is it a tower up to the god of the Bible? Well, is he Marduk? Is he trying to portray that he was? Or were the people that wrote that book trying to conflagrate it all into saying that it was? Because it's kind of strange. They talk crap about Babylon and everything and everywhere, and of course the Canaanites that they actually come from. Pretty strange. It was famously rebuilt by the 6th century BC Neo-Babylonian dynasty rulers Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar II, but had fallen into disrepair by the time of Alexander's conquest. He managed to move the tiles of the tower to another location, but his death stopped the reconstruction, and it was demolished during the reign of successor Antiochus Soter. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote an account of the ziggurat in his histories, which he called the Temple of Zeus Belus, where we have Bel as Zeus. Greeks quite often did that, where they say it's almost the same thing. According to modern scholars, the biblical story of the Tower of Babel was likely influenced by Etymology. Stephen L. Harris proposed this occurred during the Babylonian captivity, of course. Isaac Asimov speculated the authors of Genesis 11-9 were inspired by the existence of an apparently incomplete ziggurat at Babylon, and by phonetically similar between Babylon and Bebelu, meaning the gate of God, and the Hebrew word Balal, meaning mixed or confused or confounded. Philip Weidenbaum suggested Genesis 11:3 was directly referencing Herodotus' description of the construction process used in Babylon in Enki-Manki History's books 179 and 181, and therefore was written in the Hellenistic period. There's a lot more to this. Book of Jubilees, Josephus, some of these things will tell you some things. There's a lot of different looks on this idea here and the way that it would have looked. An idea, and of course when people didn't have a ziggurat to look at, they come up with ideas that are somewhere between a pyramid and a cone and a stepped type appearance here. But you can see the top part of it is all just fallen in, where they try to say, no, that means it was stopped building right there because God and all these things. Well, was there ever a storm cloud came over and it struck lightning on the top of it and did something? Sure, probably. Got inundated by rain, caused a big problem. Here's another example of what it might have looked like. Huge. Only thing is, the very top part of that there would have all crushed in. Here's a depiction of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, but if you look back in the distance to the left, there's this idea of a corkscrew right over here, and this tower where there's a ziggurat in front of it, but it's just incredibly huge and it goes up to the clouds. Other depiction shows it as being the Tower of Lesbon, looking here where it's just straight up like that. That's a German late medieval idea, depiction of the construction of the tower. Notice everybody's redhead and blonde in this too. So again, there's midrash, all kinds of things talking about this. And again, they talk about on the Book of Mormon and this, that, and the other, Arata to the goddess Inanna. And so why would, who is this? Well, she's Queen of Heaven. She's Venus. Hard to believe it, but that's in your Bible too and everything, but it's all but stripped out of it. Confusion of tongues. Kind of strange things when you actually figure out linguistics. You can actually take us back much less than the Younger Dryas event. And apparently, all of these languages, which came from a Proto-Indo-European dialect, merge in together. So whenever I say there's some truth in it, there's some truth in it.